Francesca Stavrakopoulou, I've got the correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. Is the professor of Hebrew Bible and ancient religion at the University of Exeter, with very morbid research interests, mainly on corpses. But she has other interests too. She's presented a 3-part television series on the BBC, The Bible's Buried Secrets, and contributes to Channel 4's series, The Bible, A History. Tom Holland is also familiar off the telly. He's the presenter of BBC Radio 4's Making History, has presented a large number of TV documentaries, and is author of Rubicon, The Triumph and Tragedy of the Roman Republic, Persian Fire and Millennium, The End of the World, and The Forging of Christendom. It works better if I'm not reading, right?
We can't hear you.
Okay.
You're still speaking too fast.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to stand up then while I'm speaking and then sit down. Okay, great. So what we're going to do is we're going to go straight into the discussion. We're not going to have a presentation first, but what I am going to do is ask each person to describe their work so that you can at least hear them at the beginning. Right, so that's me sitting down. Would you describe your work?
Yes. Shall I stand up?
Yes.
So as Zoe said, I'm Professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Religion at the University of Exeter. So in other words, I work in an academic context in a theology and religion department. I'm also head of department at the moment, which brings its own trials and tribulations. My research work is focused on primarily the Hebrew Bible, so what within the Jewish tradition is called Tanakh, in the Christian tradition is called the Old Testament. And I approach these texts not from the point of view of a believer, unlike most of the other people in my profession. I'm an atheist, always have been. I'm not anti-religion, I'm not hostile to religion, but I find religious points of view very difficult sometimes when I see that they can damage or limit other human beings, other non-human animals, and particularly when it limits our ability to be able to talk about the Bible in an intellectual, rigorous, critical way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's perfect. And Tom, would you do something similar?
I imagine that the reason that I've been invited here is because of one particular book that I've written called In the Shadow of the Sword, which is about the empires and the religions of late antiquity. So that's the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries AD. And what made it particularly problematic was what I wrote about the origins of Islam. I came to it not as someone who was primarily interested in Islam, but just generally in the relationship between empire, myth-making, ideology, religion in antiquity. The first book I wrote was about the collapse of the Roman Republic. The second one was about the Greco-Persian Wars. The third one was about the establishment and emergence of a distinctively Latin form of Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries. And in all those books, I was fascinated by the way in which our understanding of those respective periods was crucially shaped by people who had rewritten their own history. This is fundamental to writing history, your acceptance and understanding that your sources cannot be trusted as things that are transparent. And the more they touch on, say, the origins of cities or the origins of understandings of God, the more problematic these sources become. And having written about the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, and then the way that a distinctive monotheistic civilization emerged from the rubble of the Roman Empire in the West, it seemed obvious to me to then turn and look at what happened in the Middle East in the 6th and 7th centuries. I looked at the process by which barbarian invaders in the West became kind of Roman, became Christian, the degree to which medieval civilization derived or was a complete break from what had gone before in the Roman period. And I wanted to bring that perspective to the Middle East so that I was at least as interested in writing about the fall of the Roman and the Persian empires in the Middle East than I was in writing about the origins of Islam. So that was my perspective when I began it. What I had not realised was that the sources for early Islam were incredibly problematic, even by the standards, say, of New Testament history or the history of the early Roman Republic. And my realisation that basically a huge amount of what Muslims believe to be, as it were, gospel, is no such thing. And I remember coming back and telling my wife, I think this book is going to cause me some problems, and she visibly blanched. And gradually over time, I kind of adjusted to the fact that that I was going to have to write a history of the origins of Islam that was unlikely to meet huge favour with devout Muslim readers, and I became adjusted to it. The book came out, and there was a degree of controversy, but nothing too terrible. I had also been commissioned by Channel 4 to make a film about it. That was broadcast a few months after the book came out. It was called Islam, The Untold Story. Channel 4 had commissioned it because they knew that it would be controversial. They knew that having someone on television standing up and saying, basically, Mecca isn't Mecca. We don't really know where the Quran comes from. We don't really know who Muhammad was. Would be brilliant. You know, it was a massive tee-hee-hee from all the commissioning editors in Channel 4. But simultaneously, they had incredibly cold feet, as did I, as did everyone involved in it. And so by the time it finally came to the screen to go out, there was no breath in the listings magazines that this was controversial. Channel 4 did not hype up, did not flag up the fact that this was going to be a controversial film. So therefore, when Muslim families across Britain saw that I was going in search of the origins of Islam, they thought, oh, wonderful, hour and a half of a gentleman going in search of our beloved prophet. And then I popped up, and they weren't best pleased. And there were... well, there were a lot of threats. The fact that I had a big nose was repeatedly pointed out, implying that I was Jewish. One person said I clearly liked dressing up as a Roman emperor in my bedroom. I don't know how they knew that. And there were... these threats kind of shaded into really very violent and unpleasant menaces, directed at not just at me, but at my family, at my children. And for 2 weeks, it was an incredibly unpleasant experience. You may remember there was another film about the origins of Islam that came out rather similarly, called what was it called? I can't remember. It was the film that resulted in the American ambassador in Benghazi being lynched, and it was made by a sort of yes, that's right. And it was made by an American cop who was setting out deliberately to make Muhammad look as ridiculous as possible and to be as insulting as possible. And there was the only time that I saw the police, who'd been sort of keeping track on all the threats and everything, looking really nervous, was when Iranian Press TV, the Iranian kind of propaganda channel, released a half-hour documentary conflating that film and our film, and implying that they were part of an international conspiracy to defame the Prophet. And there was a really terrifying day where we were waiting to see if this would get any traction, whether people would start burning us in effigy. Unfortunately, it didn't, and all the anger remained focused on the innocence of Muslims, and we got left behind. And so from that point on, it's all been fine, and here I am, luckily, still alive to tell the tale. So yeah. Thank you for the invitation.
So for how much longer? A chilling story. I want to start off talking about authority and who is considered to have authority to discuss religious texts and what that does to scholarship and to intellectual life generally. So you tell me what you think.
Stand up again, yeah? Like Tom, I had similar, not quite the death threats that Tom received, but when I made a TV series, I went on TV and it was called Bible's Very Secret, and it was about looking at the ways in which archaeology can either support or challenge some of the claims made in the Bible. So we looked at things like the Garden of Eden, King David, the nature of monotheism, which didn't exist and arguably still doesn't exist. And the result of that was that I was really attacked verbally in the street a couple of times, letters, emails, by Christians and Jews, primarily Christians, who felt that I had no authority to go on TV and say that kind of stuff about the Bible, about their text. So the fact that I have a degree from here in theology, from Oxford, I've got a master's in biblical studies, I've got a doctorate, I used to teach here at Oxford, I'm a professor now in Exeter, all of that just didn't count for anything. I had people saying things like, oh yeah, well, you've got quite a nice smile, so I expect that's why you got your degrees. They'll give anyone a degree these days from Oxford.
I've never had that problem.
But interestingly, even one newspaper TV reviewer reviewed an episode of the TV series by saying something along the lines of, I'm sure whoever commissioned this 3-part documentary challenging the historicity of the Bible in no way considered what Francesca looks like, or the fact that she wanders across the screen like she's shimmied out of Song of Songs. So in a lot of ways, my authority was being challenged, both because I wasn't a believer, but also because I'm a woman. And this is very common in my particular profession. Most people in theology and religion university departments, not just in the UK, but on the continent and in the States, most are men, most are believers of one flavour or another. And because of that, there's a real issue, particularly among more evangelical members of the academic guild, which includes students, includes undergraduates, includes some of my own undergraduates. There's a real issue with the idea that a woman can have any authority in talking about biblical texts. What right have I as a woman? So certain Christian evangelical movements aren't very keen, to put it very bluntly, on women teaching about the texts. So authority is quite an interesting topic, primarily because I seem to bump against norms, bump against accepted sort of parameters, if you like, of teaching and discussion, because I'm an atheist and because I'm a woman. Now, because I'm an atheist, I like to think that actually that gives me a very objective, numbers could be properly objective, but it gives me a much more objective position from which I can dig back into the texts, into archaeological sites, look at the cultural history of these particular periods and say, in all probability, this is what it was like. This is not the way that the Bible tells it. And the reason the Bible tells it in this way is because of a certain ideological agenda, whether that's agenda power or urbanism, whether it's about identity, group identities, whatever it is, there's an ideological agenda. And that's the same with all religious writing. All religious writing is propaganda of one form or another. It's ideological. It's trying to persuade the reader or the hearer to believe something about the world, about their own worldview and their own place within it. All religious writing is like that. But all religious writing is they're also human products. So it doesn't matter what you think about the Bible, whether you think it's divinely inspired or whether you think that it kind of dropped out of the heavens. Whatever you believe about it, it's still all religious writings, whether it's the Tanakh or the Quran or the Bible, they're all human products. They're all products of human societies and human cultures. And they've all had a massive impact on the way in which we understand ourselves today, whether we like it or not, particularly the Bible, particularly in the West. So as a Western woman, I'm hugely shaped by some of the ideals that are promoted and privileged in the Bible. And so why haven't I got the right to examine this major cultural artefact, this cultural icon that the Bible is? Why can't I examine it? Why can't I deconstruct it? Why can't I look at this piece of literature like I might look at the Odyssey or any work of Shakespeare? These are all things that have influenced our cultural well-being, our cultural fabric, our sense of identity, both as individuals and societies. So why the bloody hell shouldn't I look at it?
Thank you very much. So Tom, what impact does it have, do you think, when only believers can examine text? Do you think that is mainly an impact of accuracy, or there are other implications?
Well, I think that there are actually quite significant differences in the religious traditions and the hermeneutical traditions between Christianity and Islam. Mm-hmm. And I absolutely agree. The tradition that Francesca embodies, and that to the degree I try to as well, seems to me firmly rooted in really a Christian understanding of the world that's been secularized. The Bible may well be believed to be the word of God, but even back in the patristic era, so the early centuries of Christian study, people were aware that these different books, these different portions which were being stitched together to form the Christian Bible, had human origins. And so when the Christian Bible ended up being canonized, you had within it 4 accounts of the life of Jesus, for instance. You had an Old and you had a New Testament. And so the job of trying to work out what the relationship was between these different texts, how did they come to be written, where were they written, why were they written, runs all the way through from late antiquity through the Middle Ages into the Renaissance period. The methodologies of looking at texts in this way, even though they are being practiced by believers, are sharpening and intensifying the ability to look at ancient texts and to take them apart. And what happens in the 18th and then even more in the 19th century is that that tradition is bled of its Christian context. And it is then applied to not just to biblical texts, but to, say, to classical texts as well. And so the spirit of looking at ancient civilizations and ancient texts ultimately derives principally from a Christian tradition. And I think that that means that in the 19th and maybe right the way up into the 21st century, although it can often be shocking for Jews and for Christians to have their scriptures dissected and taken apart in this manner, it's not a total shock. It is kind of going with the grain of that tradition. Now, with Islam, it is different. Islam has an intellectual tradition that is just as rich, just as sophisticated as the Christian one, but it has been shaped by its own understanding of God and its scriptures. The Quran is the word of God in a way that outdoes even the Bible, because Muhammad has, according to Muslim belief, has nothing whatsoever to do with the origin of the Quran. The Quran comes from God. It is co-eternal with God. It has existed since before the beginning of time. And therefore, it gives to the Quranic text a heft and an authority that vastly outweighs, say, that of the Bible. And so there is nothing within the Quran that would encourage Muslim scholars to ask questions such as, for instance, well, where might the various constituent elements of this text have come from? Where and when might it be written? And the thing is that the Quran is actually an incredibly difficult text to get to understand. It is very, very elliptical, very, very abstract. There are none of the convenient details that you get in the Bible, sort of naming famous rulers or famous events. There's almost nothing of that. There's only the only major power that is mentioned in the Quran are the Romans, and they get one single mention. And so as a result, Muslims, to explain how it was that the Quran came into being, started writing lives of their prophet, which explained it. And it's therefore very difficult to understand the Quran as Muslims would appreciate it, without also having this kind of cladding that is provided by the biography of Muhammad. And the earliest biographies of Muhammad that we have are about 200 years after his lifetime. And it has traditionally been assumed that the biographies of Muhammad explain how the Quran came into being, but actually it's the other way around. The Quran exists, and so therefore the biography of Muhammad is constructed to explain it. And the nearest analogy that I can think of is the way that people have tried to make sense of the life of, say, Shakespeare. We have the plays, but we don't know enough about him. We want to know more. And so you have this grand romantic tradition in which Shakespeare falls in love with a dark lady, or he hates his uncle, or, you know, stuff that you pull out of the plays and the sonnets. And so likewise, you look in the Quran, the verses are full of references of how important it is to look after orphans. And so in the traditional account of Muhammad's life, Muhammad is an orphan. There's an account of someone hiding in a cave. In the traditional biography, Muhammad hides in a cave. And so what it serves to do is to preserve the Quran within this kind of concrete of context. And what adds to it even more is something that I think derives ultimately from the Talmud, from the Jewish tradition, which is the notion not just of a written law, a written text, which is what the Quran represents, but an oral one. And these traditions are embodied in the hadiths, sayings of Muhammad, which again have the force of divine law, because Muhammad is a prophet and of God, and so therefore what he says has divine force. Now, in fact, these sayings again are not compiled until about 200 years after the lifetime of Muhammad, and so therefore the likelihood that they are the ipsissima verba of a historical Muhammad are vanishingly tiny. And it's even clearer when you reflect that the phrases that are embodied within the hadiths clearly derive from other traditions. They reflect notions of Roman or Persian provincial law, Jewish notions, Zoroastrian notions, all framed within this presumption that they were spoken by Muhammad. And of course, the reason for that is that as people from Zoroastrian, Christian, Jewish traditions convert to Islam, they want to bring something to this evolving religion. And the only way they can do that is to ascribe the traditions that they are bringing to emergent Islam to this prophet who lived in a desert a long way away from the Fertile Crescent. And so that's why you have this disjunction, which seems perfectly apparent to me. You have a religion that places its origin in the depths of a desert with the kind of sands as this prophylactic expanse around it. But it clearly derives from the Middle East. It clearly reflects traditions of the late antique Middle East. And that tension is recognizable to someone who has been brought up in the Western and ultimately Christian tradition in a way that it is not to those who've been brought up in the Muslim intellectual tradition. And so therefore, it is shocking to devout Muslims to have this methodology deployed on the life of Muhammad, on the Quran, in exactly the same way that it is for Jews and Christians analogously. But it is also even more shocking because it, I think, seems to Muslims to be an approach and a methodology that is grounded in ultimately Christian presumptions, and worse than that, godless Christian presumptions. So I think that there is a massive tension there between the rival traditions and understandings of authority that are embedded within Christianity and Islam. And I think that, although I hadn't really considered it, the process of writing this book and thinking about it has made me realise that I am, in my presumptions and my methodologies, vastly more Christian than I had appreciated when I began it.
Wow, very interesting. So I want to talk a bit about persecution complex. You think Christians have a persecution complex.
Yes.
You think Muslims have a persecution complex. Which of them, shall we say, is the most sensitive to scrutiny?
At the moment,
Well,
or over
you can
the course
choose.
of time.
You can choose your time period.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
It's a major point of reference in contemporary Christianity, particularly Protestant forms of Christianity, that to be truly Christian is to undergo or experience some kind of persecution. It's a huge theme, it's a recurring motif in a lot of New Testament texts. Jesus is supposed to have, made reference, you will be persecuted for believing in me. You've got all sorts of stories and traditions in texts like the Book of Acts, a lot of the Pauline letters. There's a sense in which Christians in the West, and I'm being quite careful about saying the West here, the West have tended to argue that they're being persecuted. So, for example, the court cases last year that went to the European Court of Human Rights, whereby a woman who was working for British Airways tried to say that she had been persecuted for her beliefs by her employer because she wasn't allowed to wear a crucifix, as part of her uniform for British Airways. They use the language of persecution quite often to describe a feeling of being threatened, of somehow their religious privileges, their religious rights aren't being regarded in the same kind of concrete ways they used to be. Eric Pickles has just been made Minister of Faith to replace Baroness Wolsey. And if you recall, he's made it quite clear several times on things like Question Time. He refers to militant atheists, like we're all kind of strapping up with guns and bombs and going on. Militant atheists who are apt to persecute Christians, who don't respect Christian faith and Christian beliefs and practices. Those Christians aren't being persecuted. Christians are being persecuted in Iraq at the moment. Christians are being persecuted in Egypt, for example. That's real persecution. And there are Muslims being persecuted all over the world too. But Christians in the West quite often have a sense that somehow, because of the increased emphasis on secularism, which is different from atheism, because of the increased emphasis on secularism in the West, of which I'm a firm supporter, there's somehow a sense that what used to be a given, that certain Christian privileges would be honoured, respected, ring-fenced, that's no longer the case. And they're crying persecution because it's a part of their identity, it's a part of Christian identity to be persecuted, to be thrown to the lions, like Daniel in the den, or like in the Roman period. There's this sense somehow that you're not a real Christian unless you're suffering. Look at the example of Jesus. But it's bollocks. They're a real Christian. I'm sorry about my language. My mum will slap me. There's a real sense somehow that to be, they don't understand how privileged they are in the West. You know, Christianity has been privileged in the West for 2,000 odd years. There are people that really are being persecuted and suffering in the world, not just for their religion, but for their sexuality, for their gender, their ethnicity. Tone it down, Christian, is what I would say.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I agree. I think that the idea of persecution has always been fundamental to Christianity in a way that it isn't to Islam. And it reflects the simple fact that Jesus ended up nailed to a cross and Muhammad didn't. And all through the early centuries of Roman rule, of Christianity's emergence, it became taken for granted that to be martyred was the supreme privilege that a Christian could have. And you have amazing martyrologies, blood-curdling descriptions of all the horrors that were inflicted on martyrs in the arena, the crowd cheering and baying as people are strapped onto burning chairs or tossed to lions or disemboweled.
Oh, it's brilliant.
And as a result, when Constantine converted, there was a slight feeling of disappointment that this was no longer a career option for an ambitious Christian. And so it's not coincidental that around this period, you start to get people going out into the deserts and becoming monks, becoming hermits, and they cast themselves as milites Christi, as soldiers of Christ, and the people they're fighting are no longer the Roman authorities, but devils. And they take it very, very seriously. They are going out into the desert, they are subsisting entirely off shit that people have trodden in. They are chaining themselves up like cows to make their life harder. My favourite hermit is an incredibly wealthy woman who buys herself a cell with an amazing view, beautiful view, and then spends 20 years not looking out at it. And she does this. She does this to demonstrate that she is truly a soldier of Christ and that the demons are there to be fought. Now, what happens with Islam is that this model of monasticism, of people going into the desert and fighting demons, is very, very important. And the desert in Islam, as in Christianity, is a realm where you commune with God and you commune with the devil. But of course, what Muslims are able to, or at least, be careful when I call them Muslims, the Arabs in the 7th century, the conquerors of this great empire, they are able to literally be soldiers of God because they are the shock troops of a great global empire. And so when they start talking about being soldiers of God, they are going off and they are fighting Romans. And it becomes increasingly embarrassing to them that they are drawing for this notion, this idea that you become ascetic, that you leave your home, you go into a place of struggle and hardship, and you fight. It becomes embarrassing that this is clearly being derived from the example of Christian monks. And so I talked earlier about how the biography of Muhammad is fabricated. It becomes very important to these militant Arab scholars who are going to the frontier with Rome in the Taurus Mountains, that their example come not from monks, but from Muhammad. And so that within this biography of Muhammad that is slowly being constructed, Muhammad is cast as a warrior. And we all know, because it's been discussed endlessly, that there are very pacific verses in the Quran and there are very bellicose verses in the Quran. And what happens over the course of the 8th century is that these scholars construct a notion called abrogation, whereby the earlier verses are abrogated by the later ones, and they cast the specific ones as being abrogated by the more bellicose ones. And they do this by constructing a biography of Muhammad in which he becomes increasingly successful as a warlord. He fights a lot of battles. He has a sword called the cleaver of vertebrae. He is a warrior. And so therefore, it's written into the DNA of Christianity, of its Messiah and of its saints, that the true Christian suffers persecution and his glory lies in heaven. The Muslim notion of a martyr is very different. A Muslim martyr, by and large, is one who dies in battle. And Islam, by and large, is the dominant religion of powerful empires. What has happened recently is that Muslims really for the first time have become minorities within societies that do not ascribe a privileged position to Islam. And so they too are now starting to pick up on this sort of Christian notion of persecution, I think. And there is a sense in which the mingled self-pity and militancy of these jihadis who are going off to Syria to attack and behead and destroy the established Christian communities there who've been there for 2,000 years and who, as Francesca said, are genuinely being persecuted, that actually they are behaving rather like militant Christians, which is probably the most insulting thing I could say to them.
So kind of moving on, kind of taking on the persecution, how do you account for what seems to be a kind of growing sensitivity, you know, a feeling that there is actually less you can say about religion now than there was 20 years ago?
I think 9/11 still looms very large within the cultural frame when it comes to thinking about religious sensitivity. What can we say about religion? To when do you draw a line between being intellectually, culturally critical of a religious system or belief or practice, and when do you cross that line and move over into religious offence? You know, there's the old adage that, you know, offence isn't given, it's taken, and I think to a certain degree that's true. But I do think that 9/11 made us all very nervous about being openly critical about cultures that are very different from our own, about religions that are very different from our own. If you remember all the hype, in, you know, not just in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, but in the few years after, the hype about, you know, you read about Islamic terrorism, Islamic extremism, but there's always a reference, you know, but the other hand, there's Christian fundamentalism. Well, what about Christian extremism? We've seen examples of Christian extremism. We've seen examples of Christian terrorism, not just in the last few years, but over the course of the last 2,000 years. But there's a real sensitivity about the way in which, if we talk about Islam in particular, that we are othering a whole culture, a whole group of people, because their religious belief systems are so different from the cultural norms of the West. Whether or not you're a Christian, in the West we are a part of this Christian culture. So when it comes to religious sensitivity, I think there's a lot of fear, primarily because Islam in particular has been vilified unfairly, it's been demonised unfairly, it's been caricatured unfairly as an intolerant belief system, an intolerant social group, an intolerant culture. But actually, Christianity is much the same. It is increasingly intolerant. Partly it's a reflection, I think, of this idea that somehow Christians are being persecuted in the West. So when it comes to things like religious offence and religious sensitivity, for me, the secret is to be polite. You probably wouldn't imagine it, given the language I've used so far. But the secret is to be polite. Just, you know, don't say anything that you wouldn't want somebody to say to you. That's my general take on it. You know, just be polite to people. It doesn't mean to say that you can't disagree with them. Of course you can. But be polite. You know, don't point out that... don't accuse them of certain racist or religious caricatures. You know, try to be careful in your language. But you can say absolutely anything as long as you frame things properly. So just don't rely on racist caricatures or religious caricatures. Unlike, you know, given the current conflict that's going on in Israel with Gaza, some of the media, the language in the media, has been inflaming certain sorts of prejudice and caricature about both Judaism and Islam, which is completely inappropriate, but it fans the flames. So to a certain extent, I think you can say absolutely anything critical of any religion, but be polite about it. You're talking about a religious system as well as talking to a person. And I think you have to concentrate on the person when you're in debate with them, rather than necessarily the religious system that you're critiquing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, what do you think being polite cuts it? Or do you think...
Yes, I think you should always be polite.
Yeah,
but you should be polite, but you should be polite but honest. But in reply to your question, why have we become more nervous about offending religions? I think that it reflects the fact that maybe when I was a child, so growing up in the 70s, most people in Britain kind of the habit of Christian faith was lost. And people always tie that up with the life of Brian. But for me, the comedy figure who best embodies that is the vicar in Dad's Army, who is, if you remember, wholly ineffective. And he's sort of limp-wristed and woolly and hopeless. Has not an ounce of spirituality within him. And I think that he became sort of representative of how most people in Britain thought of religion as something woolly and wet. And therefore, when people suddenly started burning a book because it had offended their prophet, and then even more when they flew 2 planes into skyscrapers in the name of their religion, people in the West, by which I mean, by and large, the kind of people who are here today, and the people who are in government and who are in the media and are in academia, the opinion formers, the people who basically run this country and run countries across the West, they don't have the habit of religion. We don't understand it. And we've had to re-educate ourselves about it. And that's been a complex and difficult process, because we suddenly find out that not every religious person is like the vicar in Dad's Army, that actually some of these people really believe this shit. And that comes as a shock. And what adds to the difficulty is that the religion that is creating most of the waves is not one that is native to Britain. And as Francesca said, that it is one that can all too easily be cast as the other. And there has been an understandable and commendable anxiety on part of people not to demonise a minority. It's incredibly dangerous to do that. Muslims are disadvantaged. They are, they do suffer prejudice in this country, and therefore to attack a religion that is often the basis of their life is very difficult. Now, nevertheless, I think it is vital that Islam be subjected to the same spirit of inquiry as all other religions have done. And that is, I think, for the good of everyone in this country, because religions are not static things. Yeah. They are dialogues between people at a given point in time and given scriptures and traditions. And so therefore, they're not, there is no Platonic essence called Islam or Christianity. These are constantly evolving things. And so therefore, the Islam that is in Britain and in the West will evolve. It may react against the dominant culture, but I think it's just as likely to absorb it. And so what's going on within, say, British Islam at the moment is an incredibly intense ideological conflict. It's as intense as anything that Britain has seen since, I would say, the 1650s, the decade of the Protectorate in England. And what you have is an incredibly intense and vibrant intellectual, theological, philosophical debate that is going on. And you can find it on Twitter, you can find it on the internet, you can find it in magazines across the country. It is unbelievably vibrant and dynamic. But the problem is that people in the BBC, people who edit newspapers, they do not really get it. And so they tend to think that whoever shouts the loudest and has the largest beard is the most Muslim. And the classic demonstration of this was at the beginning of this year when Majid Nawaz, a former Hizb ut-Tahrir extremist, now turned almost the polar opposite, but still a Muslim, tweeted a link to the Jesus and Mo cartoon where Jesus and Muhammad are kind of the Eric and Ernie propping up, you know, hanging out together. And he said, this does not, as a Muslim, I am not offended by this. He was then subject to an absolute campaign of demonisation by some of the more unpleasant elements within British Islam. And shamefully, neither the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, no newspaper reprinted this cartoon. And the argument was that by not reprinting, they didn't want to do it because it would offend Muslim sensibilities. But Majid is a Muslim and had demonstrated that it didn't offend his Muslim sensibilities. So implicitly, the media in this country were taking an ideological side in a debate within British Islam, and what's worse, taking the side of the most intolerant and doctrinaire aspects of Islam. And what is vital, I think, for those of us who admire Islam and want to see a British form of Islam emerge that is compatible and tolerant and integrated, it's vital that these people who are campaigning for that within Islam get our support, because at the moment they are being marginalised and silenced by the mainstream media, who would much rather parade someone with a hook. And that is really what's got to change, I think.
Yeah. You're all right. Yeah. I mean, that gets to the core of it, doesn't it? That actually, how do you create a conversation around faith that doesn't just believe the most extreme?
I think Tom hit the nail on the head when he talked about the way in which, particularly in this country, but generally in Western Christianity, for example, Protestantism has become, it's like the kind of Diet Coke, isn't it, of Christianity. It's like kind of decaf coffee. Like, what's the point? You know, if I were ever to be a Christian, which is not going to happen, I'd much rather be Greek Orthodox or Catholic. I mean, come on, give me the real magic, give me the real... But I think that's the thing. I think in some ways, when you look at the way in which certain Western Protestant Christian responses, both to Islam, to secularism, how they differ from, for example, Orthodox, you know, Eastern Christianities, or Catholic, Roman Catholic forms of Christianity, how they differ in their responses. Most of the people in the Eastern Orthodox communities are kind of pretty much just getting on with it. They have a very long-held, very firm tradition that's still changing, it's developing. But I think to a certain extent, it's got such a strong identity at its core that it doesn't really need to engage, it doesn't feel threatened by the sorts of things that perhaps Islam in the UK might feel threatened by, or Christianity in the UK and the States might feel threatened by. So I suppose, how do you build this kind of, what's the question, how do you build a conversation?
Yeah, how do you build a conversation that doesn't just privilege the kind of the most offended?
I think you need to start more generally with building a conversation around groups that are much more diverse in their makeup. So that includes women, who are very underrepresented in most mainstream religions, and it includes people from different sorts of backgrounds. A really good example is the rise of new religious movements in this country and in Europe and in the States. So this includes things like, you know, Mormonism, but it includes a lot of the new sort of nature religions and neo-paganism. They're just as disgruntled, fed up, pissed off with how boring the religion debate has become, how disconnected mainstream religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam in particular, how disconnected they've become from what they consider to be more important social aspects of being and living and thinking and loving in the world. And I think you need to include a lot more new religious movements in any debate about religion. Get religious people out of the House of Lords and construct a new kind of forum that's about the intellectual and social privileging of diverse religious voices and non-religious voices, but to include more minority groups. I was interviewed on the radio a few months ago about Scientology, and the High Court in the UK had decreed that Scientology, you know, was a religion, and what did I think about this? Surely it was a cult. Every religion is a cult. The word cult means practice and action in belief. That's basically what it means. Every single religion began as a cult, an offspring of some other form of religion. Scientology, Mormonism, whatever it is, that has exactly the same authority. It is as valid as Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism. And I think we need to recognise that. Why privilege these monotheistic texts just because they come lugging with them a huge, you know, bit of baggage that primarily is through scripture and a few guys with beards? I think it's time for a change in the way that we see religion.
What, I mean, what do you make of that, including yet more religions?
Oh, the more the merrier. Well, I mean, paganism is fascinating. When I was growing up, I was kind of, I was brought up in the Church of England. My mother was always provided me with the kind of moral exemplar, and so I've never had an issue with the moral teachings of Christianity. I've always respected them. But simultaneously, I had a real thing about Apollo and Athena, and they were the ones I really wanted. I realised I didn't really like gods with big beards, and I know I've been going on about beards, but I realised I have a kind of subliminal association of the really long beard with people telling you that you can't do things. And I kind of preferred the Greek gods because they just got on and did it, even the ones with beards, like Zeus. And so I would kind of really love to be able to believe in a Greek god, you know, or or goddess, yes. But of course, it's impossible. And now, what's he called? Oh, my brain is going. Wonderful, Ronald Hutton, yeah. Who is a historian of. Anyone read Ronald Hutton? Okay, he's a historian of the 17th century. Began that, wrote biographies of Charles II, all kinds of things like that, and then started writing all kinds of very sympathetic and incredibly scholarly accounts about paganism in the 20th century, and then outed himself in an extraordinary essay in which he revealed that he had been brought up as a pagan and to a degree was still a pagan. But he then horribly blotted his copybook among the pagan community by demonstrating conclusively that all these pagan traditions and rituals that pagans wanted to believe were timeless, primordial, had been inherited from underground currents that had been kept alive during the centuries of Christianization in Britain and had now flowered back into life, were wholly bogus, that they'd been invented from scratch in the late 19th to early 20th century, and that this idea that the witches or whatever were an archaic priesthood or something were utterly made up. And of course, in that, all he was doing was applying the same scholarly methods that have been applied to Christianity or to Islam or to whoever to demonstrate that what all belief systems do is to invent a backstory for themselves. And that what we tend to think of as the story of religions, the beginnings of religions, are simply backstories where the concrete is set. And Ronald Hutton demonstrated conclusively that the same process is going on now with neo-paganism. And understandably, this didn't go down tremendously well with his fellow pagans because they felt betrayed. They wanted, he's the most celebrated, the most cerebral of all pagans, and he had been true to his academic calling. And I think that really, all the things we've been talking about, that is the core tension. It's the tension between the desire for belief, because that desire is deeply within humans. I feel it myself. The desire for belief and the awareness that we have as educated Westerners that there are all kinds of reasons why these beliefs cannot be true, be it because the sources are inadequate and they seem to disprove what are claimed in scriptures, or because there were no dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden, or because of the Big Bang or whatever. There is a massive tension within, I think, quite a lot of us between, I always talk to both Zoe and Francesca about the Thomas Hardy poem as embodying my feelings about religion, where he's talking about on Christmas Eve, the old story that the animals talk on Christmas Eve, and he describes people in the park saying, wouldn't it be wonderful, let's go down to the stable, what if, what if? Of course, you know it's not going to happen. You know animals don't talk on Christmas Eve, but there is this kind of magic of imagining what if. And that really sums it up for me, and I think it sums it up for an awful lot of people in this country. And so I think that we shouldn't think that there is a hard and fast division between the religious and the non-religious. I think there's a sizable constituency in the middle where there is a kind of incredible tension between the desire for belief and the impossibility of belief.
Great. Yeah, you wanted to come in. Yeah, come in.
I think I disagree on
Brilliant.
the point about there's something that somehow there's something in all of us that leans towards belief, that somehow
I didn't say all of us, I said a lot of us.
I agree, but I think that's a very human thing, and I don't think it necessarily means that it's an exclusively human thing. So by that, what I'm trying to say is, when you look at the way in which across time, across societies and cultures, human beings have treated their dead, for example, you find certain animals doing similar sorts of things. It's well documented that elephants tend their dead and the bodies of their dead relatives. I've been reading a book recently that talks about fish exhibiting certain sorts of mortuary behaviours. All sorts of animals do it, cats and dogs. And I think, yes, there is something within living beings that enables us both to be social, to form loving communities and relationships. And that's the same thing, I think, that reaches out to us and makes us want to care for the ill, look after the dead, that feels sympathy and empathy for other living beings. And it's not just a human thing, it's an animal thing. And I think that is the thing that's at the very heart of most religions, to be honest. I think it's that sense of community and solidarity and wanting to be in groups that are cohesive and tied and share certain sorts of patterns and behaviours that we see. I think that's where religion begins. I think that's where almost sort of deifying of the corpse of your ancestors. You know, one of the oldest religious artefacts that we have in the world come from Jericho. And they're the famous plastered skulls of the dead. So the dead corpses have been decapitated, their skulls have been reworked, they've been covered over in lime plaster, they've had seashells or animal shells put into their eyes. You know, these things are like 6,000 years old. And it's the earliest example where you suddenly find the dead become something else for the living. And in a way, that's exactly what happens in a lot of religions, that the dead become something else for the living. Christianity, obviously, kind of tries to go one step better and literally makes a corpse become something else for the living by claiming that Jesus resurrects from the dead. I think he'd be spinning in his grave, and I think he's in his grave. I think he'd be spinning in his grave if he knew what was being said and done in his name, in terms of certain sorts of attitudes to other people, certain sorts of attitudes to Judaism in particular that Christians have exhibited. But I think that's where it comes from. I think it's not so much I think that what you describe as that wanting to believe is actually sound like a hippie, but it's kind of wanting to love, and I think that's what it is.
I would go further though and say that it's an expression of other things that are within our hearts that are also kind of becoming attenuated and cramped. And one of them is our relationship with the natural world. And it's evident when you look at any ancient belief system, and going back even beyond Jericho, back to the cave art, it's evident that the relationship with wild animals is absolutely a fundamental part of the awe that these very, very ancient peoples are bringing to their understanding of the divine. And of course we know nothing at all about what these people believed except what we've got in these caves, and you can interpret them almost any way you want. But I've never read an account of cave art that does not emphasize the significance to the artists of the natural world. And I think that that what is happening now in the 21st century in regard to the natural world is rather similar to what I'm saying, that it's become almost impossible to believe in mystery, in angels, in whatever you want, because we know so much about science, we know so much about history. Likewise, it's becoming increasingly impossible to connect with the natural world and to see nature as something intimidating, ferocious and autonomous. You mentioned elephants. You know, the elephant is in danger of going extinct in the wild. The lion is. The tiger is. All these creatures that for our ancestors, and indeed for our great-grandfathers even, embodied wildness, embodied savagery, they now live on the sufferance of horrible people who believe that rhino horn will cure their impotence. So these animals are going to be wiped out to satisfy someone who can't get a hard on. And the knowledge of that, I think, cramps and inhibits our sense of the sacred that derives from the natural world, what E.O. Wilson called biophilia. Sorry, that's a downer.
Wow.
But I think that in that sense there is, our relationship with the natural world, our desire to believe that there is wilderness and there are wild animals out there, is also kind of an aspect of our longing for the sacred.
Wow, that's pretty deep, huh?
Yeah, we like that.
If I can put us on even more of a downer.
Oh no!
Can you trace a line between what we might call a new religious sensibility and the really intractable conflicts that are going on, say, in Israel and Gaza, or between ISIS and the Yazidi or the Yazidi? Do you look at that and say this is religion becoming more forceful, or do you think that religion is actually used as a mask for pre-existing geopolitical conflict?
I certainly think that religion is often used as a mask and a prop to make certain claims about other peoples and to justify certain sorts of action. A lot of people think that the dispute that's going on in Israel and Gaza at the moment, a lot of people are confusing the Israeli government with Judaism. There are certain members of the Israeli government that similarly confuse what it is to be Israeli with what it is to be Jewish. But the two are quite distinct. Israel is a democracy, but Israel, as a part of that democracy, also has within its government some very conservative, right-wing, rabbinic and other religious Jewish factions. I completely think that politics and religion should be separate. I think we should see a disestablishment of the Church of England here. But that doesn't always solve everything. So look at the example of the States, where church and state are separate, but arguably American policy, both home and abroad, is a lot more religiously informed and motivated than perhaps our own UK policy is. So to a certain extent, I don't think, yes, religion causes wars, yes, religion causes dispute, yes, religion and religious differences are an aspect of what we're seeing going on in the Middle East and in Israel and Gaza in particular. But it's not the only aspect. It's about identity. Judaism has a particularly strong correlation between Jewish identity and land. It always has done, and that's writ large in the Hebrew scriptures. And it's a crucial ideological component. And not just about being displaced and homed again, but a very specific relationship to land. But that relationship, that ideological relationship between land and identity within Judaism isn't a coherent one, it's not a uniform one. Yes, there are certain texts in the Hebrew Bible that promote genocide, that tell the Jewish people that they need to wipe out all the indigenous inhabitants of the land of Canaan. But there are also other texts in the Hebrew Bible that simultaneously say, you need to live peaceably alongside these other people. These other people show you hospitality, you show them hospitality. You live together side by side. The Hebrew Bible writers and compilers didn't have an issue with that juxtaposition of views. So I find it very hard to understand why certain members of Israeli government and policymakers, why they should have an issue with it as well. Why can't they have that juxtaposition quite comfortably? I don't know. So yeah, religion is used as a mask and a prop. Sometimes to cover certain things, but sometimes religion is the cause of conflict, and that's exactly what Jerusalem represents. Jerusalem, the battle for Jerusalem, as opposed to the battle for Gaza or some of the Western Bank, the battle for Jerusalem is as much a religious one as it is a political one, because it's the holy city. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. It does. What do you think?
Well, religion is a manifestation of cultural identity, and cultural identity is in turn an expression of human emotions and desires and ambitions and hatreds. And so religion will take on the appearance and the contours of the various conflicts or the various conflict resolutions that of the people who believe it. And it's clear that it's perfectly possible for religion to play an incredibly valuable role in conflict resolution. I'm sure that in Northern Ireland, the fact that both sides came from, although they were Catholic and Protestant, nevertheless, they could agree on the notion that peacemakers are blessed. That provided a framework for them, a presumption that this was an ideal that they should go for. I'm sure that was incredibly useful. I think in Israel and Palestine, it's really. I mean, I just think generally in the Middle East now, it's very hard to look at it and not feel that religion is an appalling curse. You know, if you think about what Palestinian radicals looked like in the 70s, and you think about all those kibbutzim and Israeli socialists, you think actually there, even in the sort of the heyday of, you know, the aftermath of the 67 war and of the PLO hijackings and things, nevertheless there was potential there in the shared language of socialism for Israeli and Palestinian people to get together and forge a common future. I think that absolutely agree that the fact that not only Jews but Muslims as well believe that they have a divine claim on the Holy Land. Jews by virtue of their descent from Isaac, Muslims by the descent of the Ishmaelites from Ishmael, makes it really difficult. I mean, if both sides think that God's given them the land, there's not a huge scope for dialogue there. And so there, I think that religion has become more and more salient over the past 2 decades. I don't think it's caused it. I think that it's been reached for as it suits the mood of the Israeli and the Palestinian peoples. The more entrenched their hatreds and their divisions become, the more religion kind of soaks into their brain patterns, the more appropriate it becomes. But I think the most tragic manifestation of the evil, and I'm reaching for a theological word there, that religion can result in is what's happening in northern Iraq at the moment, which is unspeakable. And I don't think that's because there is something intrinsic with Islam which results in people like ISIS becoming inevitable. I think it's because the people who join ISIS, who set it up, have an unbelievably literalist interpretation and understanding of religion and of their scriptures that has no room for poetry whatsoever. And in that light, I think it's not coincidence that almost all of them seem to have been engineers or doctors. Again and again, you come across people who have flown planes into skyscrapers or who've tried to blow up airports or who've chopped people's heads off. They turn out to be doctors. They turn out to be engineers. And I think the reason for that is that they kind of think that God is like some great engineer or some great doctor who has served them a textbook and all they have to do is follow it and everything will be brilliant. And so what they're doing now in the Holy Land is they're looking into the Quran and to the Hadiths, and they're finding some of the more bloodier ones, and they're saying, oh, this is a literal thing that we should follow and we should do it. And so as a result, you have useless, incompetent, 19-year-old in-betweener style guys who have to buy a bluffer's guide to the Quran, going out there and chopping the heads of people who belong to communities who've been there for thousands of years. And it's unspeakably tragic.
So this kind of makes as much clapping noise as the other room. I mean, to put us on a more upbeat path, I'd like to come back to your point about division of church and state not necessarily being enough or not necessarily helping. Do you think there is a connection? I mean, what do you think is the kind of way forward for secularism, if not that?
I mean, I think we do need a disestablishment of the Church of England, primarily because most of the people in power, including the current coalition government in the UK, but generally speaking in the West, are people of the establishment. And being of the establishment means to be a member of a certain sort of social group that's intellectually privileged, educationally privileged, socioeconomically privileged, white, male, middle class, and by definition that means a certain sort of cultural preference within that group is going to lean towards the sorts of things that the Church of England in this country represents, that certain sorts of churches in the States represent. So it's a step. Secularism is a step towards improving the situation, but I think we need a very honest and written constitution that makes it very clear that human rights should always, always trump religious rights, regardless. And I really think that's an important thing to enshrine, if you like, in a written piece of legislation. Some religious rights, you know, I don't have a problem with religious beliefs and practices per se. I do have a problem when they are damaging either physically, emotionally, psychologically to any human being. And I have to say, I do have a problem when they're damaging to an animal as well. I don't approve of animal sacrifice in certain forms of religion. I don't think that kind of thing can ever be done in an ethical way, personally speaking. But then, you know, I'm a vegetarian. So, you know, I've got my own kind of baggage that I'm bringing to that debate. But I absolutely think that human rights should always, always, always trump religious rights. There is never a question that somebody's religious choices should somehow mean that they get privileged or special treatment. And I do think that should be a constitutional part of law. And I think for the first time we should see it as written legislation. If we were to have a written constitution, I would want that to be number one.
Yeah. So what's back? What about male circumcision, for instance?
Male
circumcision of babies.
Is male, female, is male genital mutilation?
Yes, I mean, it's been cast as that. Should that be banned?
I've done a lot of work on this within my own research on body modification practices generally in religious and non-religious contexts. I think male circumcision, absolutely fine, but wait till the kid is an adult, wait till 18. See how popular it will be then. I don't think it's appropriate. I mean, in my own research, I've published books on this. Historically speaking, there's a very close correlation within the Jewish tradition and its pre-Jewish ancient Israelite context between child sacrifice and male circumcision. Circumcision becomes a substitute rite for the sacrifice of a baby. There's all sorts of evidence to suggest it. Just as Yahweh worshippers moved away from child sacrifice, I don't see why they can't move away from the circumcision of male babies. Circumcision is fine if it's if it's a choice that's been made by a responsible adult. So leave it to 18. If 18 is the legal age of an adult in that culture, it should be 18. I don't think you should circumcise babies.
Okay, you asking Francesca a question has reminded me to let other people ask the questions. Would anybody like to ask a question? Right, I'll have that question, and then that question.
My name's Ian, I work as a counsellor, the therapeutics sort. And I was wondering about the role of bullying repressed male sexuality in the development of religion.
Do you want to take that straight away? Let's do 3 questions first, and then we'll go to company answers. Yeah.
Anthony Grayling was talking about the possibility of self-censoring in the light of the threat of violence that we see in certain contexts. Just wondered if either of the speakers have felt themselves in that situation.
Okay, and you in the front.
First, I want to thank you. I learned so much today, so really thank you. I loved most of what you said, but I do have a problem with something you said, Tom, and I'm struggling with it. I have a problem with something Tom said, and I'm struggling with it. And I think it's really crucial. Just quickly, I come from Sudan. I still live in Sudan, although I've lived in many other places, including the UK and the US. I am Christian by upbringing. I'm a non-religious person. But I'm also a Muslim by culture. I lived in a Christian Muslim culture. So some of me is Christian, some of me is Muslim. I do believe we own the right, all of us, including in Sudan, one of the most difficult environments in the world, to say that we're non-religious, which I say openly, but also to say we have the right to study Islam and have comments on Islam as much as Christianity. So I love the fact that you are studying Islam until you said something that really was like, poof. When you said the more you study it, you realize that you come to it as a godless Christian, that your methodology is a Christian methodology. And I here started getting nervous. What is Christian methodology? What is Western methodology? To me, research, knowledge, intellect, human inquiry is human. Some of it came from China, some of it came from Muslim tradition and went to Spain. We know where it all came from. So why are you still, in some ways, defining yourself as Christian, godless Christian, Western, studying Islam? And if there was a Muslim who's godless, studying Islam, would be different from you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Who wants to, do you want to do that first, and then
Yes.
you can fight that for you?
I said that because I've been brought up. I said that because I've been brought up in a Christian tradition. The intellectual and cultural traditions of Britain are clearly shot through with Christian presumptions. And as I said, the process of looking at ancient sacred texts, taking them to pieces, trying to date them, acting on the presumption that even though believers may think that they are of divine origin, in fact they are probably not, and they are of human origin, and trying to ground them on that presumption. That seems to me, I have to say, where does that tradition, where does that presumption come from? And it seems to me clearly that it comes from, ultimately, Christian intellectual approaches to the Bible, to studying the Bible, to trying to work out how these different books within the Old and the New Testaments, the various Gospels, the letters of Paul, relation to the Gospels, all these kind of questions, which are fundamental to the kind of discipline and work that, say, Francesca does, they derive from the example of the Church Fathers through medieval study of the Bible into the Renaissance, and then what happens in the Enlightenment is that this becomes de-Christianized. And I am in that line of tradition. And the thing that focused it for me was the discovery. You see, I had thought that what the likeliest way in which this intellectual methodology developed was that in the Renaissance, people start looking at Plato or Virgil or whatever, and applying critical methodologies to these ancient texts, and then they move on and they apply it to the Bible. But it's the other way round. It's the study of biblical texts that provides classical scholars with the model for how to analyse these ancient texts. So therefore, of course, I'm not in any way denying that there are not phenomenal intellectual traditions in other cultures, but I'm not Chinese, I'm not Muslim. The traditions that I have inherited come from Christian forebears. That's not to say that my approach is the only one, or that a post-Christian approach is the only one. But there is nothing within, it seems to me, the Muslim intellectual tradition, which, as I said, is unbelievably rich and powerful, that would encourage a Muslim to look at the Quran and say, did this actually come from God? Does
that answer your question? Okay. Who wants to do male sexuality?
Oh, I'll leave that to Francesca.
I'm happy to talk about male sexuality. Within Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, God is a man. God has a penis. This is a God whose penis is circumcised originally, basically, and this isn't just talking in mythological sense. This is the way ancient people that wrote these texts believed that their God had a body, and believed that that body was male, and that body, as some of us would now define it, and that that body had a penis. So the normative sexual behaviour of a person is to be male and to try and impregnate women. So this is at the very root, within the Jewish traditions, of the cultural norms that developed, particularly out of Judaism and Christianity, because of the privileging, the rendering an icon of the Bible. Because of the Bible's place in Western culture, it's that idea that God is a man and has a penis, but chooses not to use it. That basically is at the root, I think, of certain religious and cultural prejudice against male sexuality, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual. The idea is that, women weren't even classed as a body within Christianity as such. We were deviant, deformed versions of the real body, which just happens to be male. There was no set sense of gender, male and female, despite what biblical text might tell you, this idea about male and female wasn't as hard and fast a sort of distinction. They weren't monolithic within the ancient world. There's evidence of a third gender in ancient worlds, you know, what we refer to as eunuchs, for example, in some texts. So that idea about male and female being the only two options, that wasn't really the case in the ancient world at all. And for the biblical writers, the idea rather was that a proper body was one that had a penis, and a penis that was circumcised. Circumcision it's a fertility practice originally. It kind of, like you would prune a fruit tree to render more fruit, prune the penis, you get more kids. So that's basically what circumcision is all about. So the idea that women's sexuality, particularly amongst early Christian writers, was linked with sin and transgression from an appalling misreading of the Garden of Eden story in Genesis. Christians are to blame for that. There's no such thing as the fall or sin or the devil in earliest Judaism and in Genesis. When Satan appears in the Old Testament, he's a good guy, he's a mate of God's. But also they blamed women because the body became dirty. One of the biggest problems that Christianity has given the Western world is the dichotomy of the mind and the body, of the soul and the body. Once you decide that it doesn't really matter what happens to your body because your soul's going to go to heaven anyway, that means you get a vilification of the body itself. And as a result, what you do to the body, whether it's torturing somebody, raping somebody, impregnating somebody, whatever it is that you do, somehow this material, fleshy reality isn't that valuable anyway. And that's one of the biggest tragedies of Christianity, is that it's lumbered us with this way of looking at individual human beings, and particularly women, and particularly those men and women who don't conform to certain sexual preferences that God supposedly endorses in the Bible. Does that answer your question?
Can I
Yeah.
just stop? I mean, there's an obvious contrast there with Islam, that Jesus, despite what this probably bogus piece of papyrus says, didn't marry, according to tradition. Muhammad had quite a few wives. And in the Quran, captured slave women are part of the booty that is promised to the faithful. And in the Quranic paradise, you have, it's brilliant. You have gorgeous women who you can deflower and then they become virgins again, and they give you wine, and it's wonderful. Famously, of course, what happens to the women when they go to paradise? Doesn't say. It's just for the men. And I wonder whether there's a kind of Puritanism, perhaps, in some Muslim families within the West as a reaction to the perceived libertinism of society abroad, whether knowing that as a warrior of God, you would be entitled to have slave girls, and if you die, you will then go up to heaven and have all these eternally reconstituting virgins, whether that possibly, the sort of sexual frustration is a part of it. But I'm not in any way qualified to talk psychology, so I don't know, I throw that open.
Okay. Well, while you're standing, why don't you have a go at the middle question too?
Remind me of the middle question?
Self-censorship on the ground of fear and threat, and you touched a bit on what the reaction to your programme, and I know you're interested.
I've consciously tried never to censor myself because I think that the threat of violence is vastly overplayed. I think, in a way, I feel that the Islamophobic thing to do is to imagine that if you say anything hostile to Islam, Muslims will come and kill you. That's what fear of Muslims mean. They won't, and they don't, and they haven't done. And the whole way through, even when I was getting the death threats, I never really worried about them, except for that one day, for obvious reasons. Because what it was saying was not so much, it wasn't really saying anything about religion or Islam. It was saying that there are a lot of bastards on Twitter, but we all know that.
Yeah.
Tom Daly knows that. Mary Beard knows that.
Yeah.
So I wasn't worried about that. I'll tell you the one thing where I do sense, I have censored myself, and what I was most worried about wasn't that I would get killed, it was that I would be exiled from the Liberal Club. That's what I was worried about. That's what I still sometimes worry about. If I say this, will I seem racist?
Yeah.
That's what I worry about, because ultimately what matters to me really is to have the respect of people that I respect, and the people I respect are not racists. And so therefore the idea of being seen by them as a racist is almost the worst thing that I can imagine, and that's when I feel inhibited.
Yeah. What do you think?
My experience is slightly different. I've had a lot of hate mail, but I've also had a lot of love mail, and I have to say, that's worse than the hate mail.
No, I've never had that.
That might sound flippant, but actually I was more frightened by some of the overtly sexual, threatening emails, tweets, letters that I got. You know, some guy turning up at my office door insisting that he wanted to talk to me. I was more frightened as a woman than I was as an atheist. So in other words, I felt more of a threat from very overbearing men, strangers, than I did from overbearing Christians and Jews. I expect to be hated by certain religious people. I try not to censor myself, and I have to say I'm very sad to say this, but I often have to censor myself in the lecture room because an increasingly large number of undergraduates studying theology of religion in the UK are being taken over by the very evangelical Christian unions that are on university campuses. And so they might come to study with us with a very open mind. They might be religious, they might not be, but they are very quickly, if they're vaguely Christian and Protestant, they will very quickly be enveloped in the loving embrace of the evangelical Christian union movement that's heavily funded by American evangelical movements. And then I have to self-censor because it's only particularly the last few years, I've been teaching the kind of stuff that I put on TV, the kind of stuff, I've been teaching this for years, here in Oxford, in Exeter, and I've never experienced the kind of intolerance amongst students as I have in recent years teaching. And that's when I have to self-censor because I don't want to have to, I've only got an hour or 2 hours in a lecture to get through certain material that I think is really important. And if I have to stop to defend and everything that I say on the basis of somebody's particular faith position, then I'm never going to get through the module.
But can't you just tell them not to shut up?
Yeah, I do, and I'm very clear at the beginning. I always say we're looking at these texts from the perspective of their ancient cultural context, not in a Christian way. This is pre-Jewish, pre-Christian, but people are these are their texts. It comes back to the idea of authority, but these are my texts. How dare you tell me what's in them? Well, I'm the professor. I'm telling you what's in them from my particular perspective. So you can. So I always say, I'm very happy for you to have these kinds of discussions, but leave them at the door when you come in for a lecture because these are the certain things. So I have to be very clear about why we're learning what we're learning, why we're using this methodology, what the intended learning outcomes are. I have to hide behind that because otherwise I just end up having another debate about whether angels exist. So yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah.
I've got the methodology. You should have asked him this.
Oh, sorry.
Christian methodology.
Yeah. Can I have one more question? Okay, answer that.
The question was, is there such a thing as a Christian methodological?
Are we talking about a way of looking at religion that's Christian Western versus something else?
No, I think what we're doing is the Christian methodological, as Tom was saying, methodological approaches, critical approaches to the Bible also gave rise to critical approaches to all historical documents and to all works of literature. That in itself was inherited from the ancient rabbinic tradition, in which debate and disputes about what particular Bible verses mean and what did God really intend when he said this and what did Moses, that all comes from a Jewish tradition. And that in its turn comes from a much broader Mesopotamian tradition in which debate about, and ancient Egyptian, in which debate and argument about what do the gods really mean. So it's a much broader cultural endeavour. What I would say is that the West has been the most successful in shouting its own preferences for science and rationality and logic loud and proud, dressed up as democracy and trying to colonise the rest of the world. I'm perfectly happy with the way that other people do stuff, whether it's approaching text or history or however they want to do it. Completely fine. The Western paradigm is one paradigm, and it's only Christian because the West has traditionally been Christian rather than Jewish or Muslim or Hindu.
Okay.
So
I really, really want to take more questions, but I'm not allowed, and somebody's shaking their head furiously at me, and I'm very sorry. But you can, maybe you can catch them on the way out. Thanks everybody for listening. Thanks for the time.